I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation, and I also thank Michael for giving such a good first introduction to what I'm going to talk about. And I would like to start with the question of motivation. For a very long time, the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis was an American-centric story. It was a story told mainly by American policymakers and historians on the basis of their information and their perspective. And more, in the last 20 years, we are getting Soviet documents, former Soviet documents, and Cuban documents, which allow us to look at the story from a different angle, from a different perspective. About 10 years ago, Sergo Mikoyan began working with the National Security Archive on a book that he wanted to publish in the United States. And this book just came out 2 days ago. It's called The Soviet-Cuban Missile Crisis. And it means that the Soviet Union had its own crisis with Cuba, which was very serious. And that crisis lasted much longer than just 13 days, as we know from the American historiography. And in addition to the documents that we're publishing in this book, Sergo Mikoyan gave the National Security Archive his entire personal archive of his father's documents during the Cuban trip and before the Cuban trip. And they allow us to draw some conclusions and some lessons. And to begin with, I would like to talk about the motivation. When I began studying the Cuban Missile Crisis, what I heard, and I went to graduate school in the United States, what I heard is that the Soviets were mainly interested in putting pressure on the United States on Berlin, on the issue of Berlin. And that the second motivation was to redress the strategic balance, because the ratio of deliverable nuclear firepower was the disadvantage of the Soviet Union was just enormous. However, the more I read the Soviet documents, I came to the conclusion that the motivation was not simple. Like any important human decision, you don't make that decision for just one reason. But most importantly, in all the Russian documents that I've read, and in the Mikoyan documents, there is no Berlin issue linked to Cuba. Later in the crisis, we see actually the opposite. We see Mikoyan talking to the Cubans, and in his correspondence with Khrushchev, if they do something against Cuba, where can we respond? Maybe then we can put pressure on them in Berlin. So that motivation simply was very low on the Soviet list of priorities when they were deciding to put the missiles in Cuba. And the main motivation really was to defend Cuba. And you see it both in the internal discussions that are now available, and you see it in the correspondence between Mikoyan and Khrushchev, and you see it in Mikoyan's conversations with the Cubans. I would say number one motivation was to defend Cuba, because in March and April 1962, the Soviets were getting more and more intelligence that made them think that another invasion was imminent. They knew about Operation Mongoose. They also knew about the planned military maneuvers on Vieques that were called Ortsak and were scheduled to take place in October. So around late April, May 1962, the Soviets come to realization that they have to do something now. They have to do something urgently, because Cuba was a very important ally, and Michael already talked about it. So in addition to the strategic importance of Cuba, the first socialist country in Latin America, the country that did not borrow the revolution from the Soviet Union, the Soviets, who already were kind of somewhat cynical, a lot of them, about where their own revolution went. They saw that Castro's revolution was genuine, and they had a huge emotional attachment, both the leadership and the people. And also you see it from the kind of people they sent there. They sent their best poet, Yevtushenko, who was actually in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, wrote poetry about the revolution and the crisis. They sent cinematographers and all the other specialists that Michael already mentioned. Strategic balance. There was, of course, a consideration for strategic balance, but you almost don't see that at the political level of discussion. The military, and especially the defense minister, Rodion Malinovsky, was thinking about the strategic balance, and the military did realize that putting missiles in Cuba would help this big global strategic correlation of forces. Now, even McNamara, during several of the conferences that we had, he said that actually putting these missiles in Cuba did not alter the strategic balance in a significant way. So that's about motivation. Now, when the decision was made at the Presidium in Moscow in May 1962, before the actual decision is voted on, Khrushchev starts talking with the people who were closest to him. And the first person he shares this idea with is actually Anastas Mikoyan. And Anastas Mikoyan responds pretty negatively to the idea of putting missiles in Cuba. He says that, first of all, they would not so much defend the Cuban Revolution, they would most likely provoke the United States. And that might lead to a crisis, which is exactly what happened. And secondly, he also predicts Castro's reaction pretty well. He says Castro would not agree to take the missiles because that would make him a pawn, a Soviet puppet in Latin America, and he doesn't want to be seen this way. And so then they decide to sell this to Castro. They present it to Castro as you should accept these missiles not only because they will defend Cuba, but in the interest of the entire socialist camp. And since now you are part of the socialist camp, you should care for the interests of the camp in general. And this is why Castro agrees to take the missiles. His motivation is mainly to play a role in this big global competition or confrontation, and secondarily also to defend Cuba. Castro correctly believed that you didn't need those missiles, especially the intermediate and medium missiles, to defend Cuba. Mikoyan played a very important role throughout the spring and the summer and the fall of 1962, not just in November. He initially was against deploying the missiles. He also was against, in the summer, he was against putting the missiles in secretly. He believed, as did many of the top advisors, including Ambassador Alexeyev, that if we were going to put missiles in Cuba, we had to do it publicly and sign an agreement, a military agreement with the Cubans, just like the United States put the missiles in Turkey. Putting the missiles in Turkey right next to the Soviet borders, of course, was very humiliating for the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union had to accept it. The Soviet Union had to swallow that blow. And in a way that explains why Khrushchev thought the United States would do the same. If we put the missiles in Cuba, well, this is just the same as them putting the missiles in Turkey. And so Kennedy, when he is presented with fait accompli, he would have no other choice but to accept it. The difference, of course, was that the Soviets were doing it secretly. As I said, Mikoyan was critical of the decision itself to deploy the missiles. He was also very critical of the way it was done. The missiles were brought to Cuba secretly, but they were never camouflaged well in Cuba, which of course led to the fact that they were easily discovered and photographed by the United States. I will not talk about the 13 days of the crisis. I think we know that story. It's pretty well covered. But I would like to emphasize that on October 28, when the American public could rest easily and go to sleep thinking that the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved, the Soviets knew very well that it was not resolved, that what they had in Cuba was very dangerous. It was a massive group of forces. As Michael pointed out, it was not just the intermediate and medium missiles. There were 42,000 combat troops in Cuba. There were about 100 tactical nuclear weapons. There was a strong aviation component, a naval component. There were 4 Foxtrot-class submarines sitting right next to Cuba, armed with nuclear torpedoes, and because of the technical difficulties they were experiencing, it was very hard for them to maintain communications with Moscow. And Moscow was not informing their own submariners or their own troops in Cuba about the negotiations. So all the 13 days, Moscow does not inform Fidel Castro that they're negotiating with the Americans. All the information that the Cubans had was that if America takes any aggressive step against Cuba, the Soviets will defend Cuba with everything they have. They will not give an inch. They are ready to defend the revolution. When the Cubans were in Moscow in the summer negotiating the military treaty, Rodion Malinovsky said to them, if Americans invade, we will send the Baltic Fleet. And what they were doing, in fact, they were negotiating with the Americans behind the backs of the Cubans, but also behind the backs of their own military. The Soviet military, during those 13 days, they bonded with Cubans so much that emotionally and psychologically, they were more together with the Cubans than with their central authorities, central command in Moscow. Because for those 13 days, they're preparing to fight a war, nuclear or non-nuclear, and die with the Cubans for the defense of their country. With that situation, when Castro learns on the radio about Khrushchev's concessions to the Americans, naturally he feels betrayed, humiliated, and abandoned by the Soviet ally. And the Soviet military are just stunned. They were just assembling those missiles 24 hours a day, preparing them to battle readiness. And suddenly they're told, disassemble, fast, load them on the ships, show them to the Americans. They also felt humiliated. Some of the military veterans told us that soldiers were crying creating the weapons. So Khrushchev has to deal with that. He sends his best top Cuban specialist, Anastas Mikoyan, to Cuba. And this is an incredible human story. It's an irony that a person who was the only strong opponent of the decision in the Presidium now has to go to Cuba and untangle this knot that Khrushchev tangled with deploying the missiles, deploying them secretly, and not even camouflaging them well. And the fate of the military agreement is also in the air, because they never signed it. They drafted it in the summer, and they were going to sign it at some date in November, when they were going to announce the presence of the troops. So when Mikoyan gets to Cuba, another terrible thing happens. His wife of 43 years dies. But he already knows during his first conversations with the Cubans that the situation is so serious, he cannot just leave. He cannot just go back. Therefore, he sends his son, Sergo, who was with him the first days of his mission, and he stays in Cuba to negotiate the withdrawal of the weapons. Mikoyan has three big tasks in Cuba, and all of them are very difficult. The first one is to negotiate the withdrawal of the weapons, to figure out which weapons will stay, which weapons would leave, and how many of the Soviet troops will leave. The second task is to somehow persuade Fidel Castro to agree to inspections. Again, he was not consulted, and it's his sovereign territory. He was not part of the agreements. Khrushchev committed to allow inspections on the Cuban soil, but he never asked people who are actually in charge of the Cuban soil if they could carry out inspections there. And Castro said, no, we're not going to allow any inspections. Why it was important? Because if inspections were not carried out and the United States was not sure that all the weapons, offensive weapons, left, then the United States would not commit to a non-invasion pledge. Then the Kennedy administration would not have given the non-invasion pledge. And that was the main goal for the Soviets at the moment, to get the non-invasion pledge. And the third goal, which was also very difficult at the moment, of course Khrushchev could have just pulled all the troops and say, no consultations. We don't care what you think. They wanted to keep Cuba as an ally. As I mentioned before, Cuba was seen as a very important ally. Khrushchev could not just lose Cuba. In fact, when Khrushchev was removed in 1964, he was one of the biggest accusations was exactly the reckless and adventurous behavior during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they wanted to keep Cuba. So Mikoyan had to mollify Fidel Castro and keep the alliance. And the initial deal, the military agreement that was prepared in the summer, provided for a massive Soviet military base on the island. If that base was fully deployed, it would be the strongest Soviet military base outside of its borders, stronger than any one in even East European countries. Now, the position changed several times, actually, during Mikoyan's discussions in Cuba, as he was realizing how dangerous the situation became. And I really encourage you to read the verbatim transcripts. We know every word that Mikoyan and Cuban said to each other. We know every word that Mikoyan and the center said to each other. Endless telegrams, several telegrams a day. So from the first plan to keep a massive military base on Cuba and to keep tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba and to keep the Il-28s with the bombs in Cuba, Mikoyan changes that position, of course, with consultations with the Presidium, to the next position, which would be to leave tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba, withdraw most of the troops, but keep the combat brigade in Cuba, and to gradually, over time, train the Cubans to use all the remaining weapons. To the final position, which happens after the crisis escalates a little bit in the middle of November with the order to shoot at low-flying reconnaissance planes. And that order, in turn, was issued by Castro in response to Khrushchev's next big concession, pulling out Il-28s. So finally, Mikoyan comes to the conclusion that tactical nuclear weapons would have to be withdrawn. He consults with the Presidium. The Presidium agrees his course of action, and on November 30th, all tactical nuclear weapons were loaded on the ship Arkhangelsk, and on December 1st, the ship left the port Mariel and reached the Soviet Union on December 20th. So by the end of November, the Cuban Missile Crisis was actually resolved, and all tactical nuclear weapons left Cuba. Looking at this wealth of documents we got and at the negotiations, it seems like the conclusion here is that for a long time we thought Kennedy's decisiveness in the crisis and Khrushchev's recklessness is what brought us there. I think what this story tells us is that there was recklessness on both sides, that Kennedy's actions and American actions, not just Kennedy actions, toward Cuba were reckless before the crisis. You take the Bay of Pigs, you take Operation Mongoose, you take Ortsak, and Khrushchev's decision to put the missiles in secretly to create such a concentration of forces was also a reckless decision. But once they saw the danger of real nuclear war, both sides stepped back and both sides became very responsible and cautious. There was no moment when the other guy just blinked. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev became willing to negotiate and very unwilling to take any aggressive step toward each other or toward Cuba. And unfortunately, what they also did, both of them, they did not realize that Fidel Castro was not just, Cuba was not just a parking lot for the weapons. It was a very strong, independent variable in the crisis. He was an actor who played a key role. And if Mikoyan was not in Cuba, maybe the crisis could have been much more dangerous. Thank you.